Well, here's an interesting one that a lot of people may not know about. This is a mummy market for selling mummies in ancient Egypt circa 1865. Here you can see a mummy propped up against the wall here, and apparently this was done during the New Kingdom whenever they had perfected their ways of embalming, and there was a period of time there whenever they hardly used the bitumen or tar looking black lacquer that they would coat the bodies with like a paint and make them look very dark. But so this is very light one though, like Ramses and so on. You can see his chest is excavated there, and also in the foreground here in the bottom, there's a hookah pipe sitting there and another wrapped mummy that the top part or head area has been unwrapped. Let's see if I can pull that down a little bit. And shows that they've exposed his head there and probably broken his head off, but he's attached with it, and there's some jugs and things there to go along with it. This was a craze that actually was fed by Caucasians' interest in their own history. That at this time there became a fad for people to have mummy unwrapping parties. Quite often with people that were rich would do these type of things and invite over a party, and one of the big festivities would be there, they would unwrap a mummy and look at all of his wrappings and all the things that go along with it. This picture kind of reminds me of a story that I heard in a book, must have been 35, 40 years ago now, and it was in an old book at the time too. It was like canvas backed and so on, probably in the early 1900s the book was written. But in there they talked about how people were actually taking some of these bodies and grinding up the meat part of the body and making it into a paint, basically. And that this paint was very fragrant because, of course, the bodies had been coated with this bitumen with all these different things in it. There was even a time whenever people were actually crunching up and snorting it. Crunched up bodies. It's hard to believe something like that, but people would get high off of it too, because these bodies were quite often rubbed with different narcotics, let's just say. And so there was a buzz that was attached to it somewhat. And one of the stories in this book talked about how a man was extremely irate that he had gotten a bunk mummy, apparently, or his snuff was bunk and it didn't do what it was supposed to do. And one of the weirdest accounts too was one that was taken from, and they had put this, I wish I could find this book now, but I don't even know the name of it anymore. I can remember what the cover kind of looks like and really the fabric. But they talked about how this nobleman in England, somebody fairly well off, was having a party, and this guy got invited to it, and was his account of the party, and that he had gone to and had such a wonderful time, but there was a mishap, and the lord of the house was kind of miffed about the whole thing because he had put it all out to everybody that they were opening up a nobility or king of Egypt. And after they got through with their dinner and things like that and went to the room where a lot of people used to have antiquities, much like you'd think of as a china cabinet, but then there was all these knickknacks and things in there and antiquities from around the world and starting to collect and stuff. And this was, of course, led to our modern museums and things like that that's happening here, so people could come and wouldn't have to make the large trip there, but it also might entice someone to make that trip. But at this party, they went to open up this sarcophagus. It actually had a real sarcophagus with a head depiction and everything like you think of pharaohs. So it's sad to say, but this might have actually been a real pharaoh. And when they opened it up, they were miffed because inside of it was, as they unwrapped it, they realized that it was a woman. And she had long reddish hair. And that this was supposed to have been a king of England or a pharaoh. And he was miffed and thought that someone had switched his mummy or done something like that or whatever. But it was still intricate, and as they unwrapped it, they had all of these things that came with it and so on. So it was pretty interesting. Nowadays, we might look at this and realize that there were women pharaohs, and this quite possibly could have been Hatshepsut herself or someone like that, or a nobility or a queen, and yet it was just kind of dismissed off, and he was kind of miffed about it. But the strange thing there is that it showed that it was a woman with long or auburn hair, like you see in a lot of Egyptian mummies that we still have today. After these parties had done, a lot of people would take these and give them to the museums that were starting up so they could have an exhibit about Egypt. But apparently this was happening so much that they were overwhelmed with the amount of mummies that were just given to them and donated to them in the museum after this point here. There's strange stories that were in that book too. It just seemed like one paragraph would say something crazy and another one would say another one crazy, as if the things I have said now are not crazy enough. But there were manifests that they talked about and showed that where they were on ships heading to certain places, and this was really something they were, en masse doing. The locals, they didn't care. They didn't have a museum or anything at that time, and they apparently, they didn't care. But they had these manifests which showed where they would go and do different things. And then another paragraph talked about how there was a steam engine going somewhere in America, and I forget where it was to and from, but in between there they recanted that they actually fueled the boiler for this thing from dead mummies, which sounds kind of odd, but with the tar on them and stuff, they actually probably would burn pretty good, but that makes no sense really in actuality. But who knows, it may have happened, but it may have also been just kind of written up. And this book was in the early 1900s, so the craze had just quit decades before that, where people had finally realized, that maybe that's not that cool, and so a generation got to experience it. But kind of neat. Now we of course have museums, we can see all these, but one wonders whenever you think about something like this, how many people were lost and how many people were in a sarcophagus, and actually somewhat nobility. You can tell in the arm position on the one on the right here that you see where it's just down regular, and that's normal. Whenever you have somebody in nobility, their arms are usually done in a crossed form. So another telling sign too. But let me know if you've heard anything weird that happened out of this too. But what it did do eventually, of course, it ended up raping all of the necropolises that they had around there, and all kinds of tombs and pits, because they were just so easy to sell them away for cheap, basically. But what it did do eventually was show that the tourism was something that was very interested. People were very interested in the ancient Caucasian Egyptians here, wanted to know more about them and see things. And instead of having a few mummies and a few trinkets in an exhibit, maybe you could come all the way there. And then of course nowadays we have there where they really live off the tourist idea. The country would be much poorer if they didn't have the tourist industry attached to this idea now. So kind of flipped things there inside of 150 years, quite different. Well, a lot less than that when you figure they started making the Cairo Museum and so on. But irregardless, here we have something that we probably like to forget about and how it went through, but sure enough, something that happened in true history. And you can see this is a mummy market again from 1865, about the time of the end of the Civil War in America. So that kind of dates it there. Anyhow, moving on. Peace.